Welcome to the C-Suite series on Channelchek. I'm Michael Kopinski, the Director of Research at Noble Capital Markets. Noble is the source of all equity research on Channelchek and the source for small and microcap companies. These are companies that may not be front and center on CNBC, but represent the best and the heart of the North American economy. Of the 6,000 small and microcap companies listed on Channelchek, in this program, we're featuring Neovasc. The stock symbol is NVCN. Noble analyst Ahu Demir will interview Bill Little, the Chief Operating Officer. In this interview, investors will learn about the company's revolutionary heart products and the upcoming milestones within the next year. This interview is educational, especially for people that have chest pain. Before I turn it over to Ahu, if you'd like to get Ahu's research on Neovasc, on channelchek.com, type in the ticker NVCN in the search box in the top left section of the site. I encourage you to stick around for the closing comments when Ahu and I discuss the key takeaways from this interview. With that, Ahu, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. Here, Bill Little, who is the Chief Operating Officer, is representing Neovasc. I wanted to start with your background, Bill, if you don't mind to provide some background of yourself.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to speak with you all. So I studied marketing at the University of Colorado, and then after a couple of years of believe it or not, working for the Gallo Winery in Vail, Colorado, I went to work for Boston Scientific when I was about 24 or 25 years of age. And I've essentially spent the last 25 years of my career in the cardiovascular medical device space. I spent 13 years at Boston Scientific, a few years at C.R. Bard, which is now part of Becton Dickinson. And then I took on a role leading global marketing for what was at the time St. Jude Medical, running their cardiology marketing group, having interventional cardiology and structural heart. We were ultimately acquired by Abbott, and after spending several years at the new St. Jude Abbott organization, I came across Neovasc, and I've been here ever since.
That sounds great. It's an impressive background, and we appreciate your time and happy to have you for our discussions. So why don't we start with a high-level introduction to the company? What are the current assets, what stage you're at, and also maybe you can provide us some information on how unique and what makes Neovasc unique compared to the.
It's an interesting story. So when I was working at Abbott, I happened to be at a cardiology meeting in Paris last year, and part of my responsibility at the time was to look for new companies and new opportunities that potentially Abbott could look at. And I came across Neovasc at this meeting in Paris and became really intrigued and learned quite a bit about it, and ultimately got so enthused with the organization that I called the CEO, Fred Colin, and said, Fred, I love what you guys are doing. I believe in what you're doing, and I want to be a part of it. I'd like to come work for you. And that's actually how I ended up coming to Neovasc. And what really made me so interested in the organization initially was the reducer device. And as I learned more about our Tierra mitral valve opportunity, it really seemed to be a great fit for me. And so what attracted me about the organization was fundamentally the products. And we've got two really interesting products. First is the reducer device that treats refractory angina. And what that is chest pain that doesn't go away for patients. And you know, as we discussed earlier, I'd essentially spent my entire career in interventional cardiology and in structural heart disease. And here's Neovasc, a company that has a device, the reducer, that is used in areas where interventional cardiology certainly comes into play. And then here's the Tiara family of devices that are used in structural heart disease. So it was a very natural fit for me. And what was so intriguing about the reducer device is that most patients that have stenting procedures done, a large majority of them have them done because they have chest pain. Now, many of these patients are actually having heart attacks, but most patients that get stents have stable disease, they have current or chronic chest pain, and the stent is used to open up the blood vessel to allow blood to flow through and treat that chest pain. Unfortunately, for a lot of those patients, even after they have a stent or after they have bypass surgery, they still have chest pain. And they'll take medical therapy, they'll take pills, they'll take drugs to help that chest pain go away, but they're ineffective. And so we call that refractory angina. That is chest pain that isn't treated by surgery or isn't treated by medical therapy. And when I saw this reducer device and the data surrounding it that suggested for these patients that have refractory angina that there's nothing we can do for, the device was so effective that it really seemed like a breakthrough to me. So that's what initially brought me to the company.
That sounds great. So could we maybe dig in through reducer first, start with reducer. So you do actually have an approval in Europe. And then could you maybe talk about the market potential and when do you expect to come to the US markets?
Yeah, so I'll give you some perspective and maybe I'll frame it up using the US market and we can extrapolate that worldwide and sort of who we're going after first of all. So for perspective, there's about 1 million stenting procedures done per year in the US. There's another 1 million or so in Europe and another 1 million or so done in Asia. So about 3 million procedures worldwide. And as I talked about earlier, about 1/4 of those patients after they get a stenting procedure still have chest pain. So you do the numbers on that, and that's, call it 750,000 incidental or new patients per year that are getting these stenting procedures and still have chest pain. So it's an absolutely massive opportunity. There's another gigantic group of patients, and that is patients that go in before they have a stenting procedure, and you go in and get what's called an angiogram. That's a basic moving x-ray of your heart where physicians can look at the blood vessels in your heart and determine if there's a blockage. Well, most patients that get angiograms, they get them because they have angina. Unfortunately, maybe 40 or 50% of the time, we go in and we look for blocked vessels, and there's no obvious blocked vessels in those patients. So there's nothing to stent, there's nothing to bypass, yet those patients today don't have a good treatment option. We can't give them medical therapy. We've already tried. We're giving them everything we can, and they still have chest pain. There's nothing to stent, there's nothing to bypass. So those patients just have to suffer. We believe there may be an opportunity for those patients to be served by reducer as well. So you take that, extrapolate that market worldwide, and all of a sudden you get into a multi-billion-dollar opportunity for the device.
That sounds great. That's a great overview. So what would be the main catalyst for reducer?
Yeah, so we are, as you mentioned earlier, we're commercially available in Europe, and we've seen strong double-digit growth in Europe. We're looking forward to reporting our second quarter earnings here in the next several weeks, and we see strong growth outside of the United States. And the next big thing that we're looking towards in the reducer family would be progress with the FDA. And so we've disclosed that we submitted our application for US approval at the very end of last year. We've had a very successful 100-day meeting with the FDA, which is part of the regulatory approval process. The next thing that we would look for, the next big catalyst for the reducer device, would be the potential for an FDA panel meeting. And we're hopeful that we'll have an opportunity to have a panel meeting in the back half of this year, potentially. And that would give us an opportunity to bring scientists and clinicians and patients and regulators together to talk about the risks and benefits of the reducer device, and ultimately would be an important step towards a potential approval for the reducer device in the United States. And that's something that we see as a real potential value creator if we can get into that large US market. There's nothing like this device in the United States, and so much so that the FDA granted the reducer device breakthrough device status. And they do that when a device treats a condition that there's no other option for, and we can do that with reducer. We know these patients are refractory. We know that medical therapy isn't helping them. We know that they're not helped by stenting or bypass surgery. And so this innovative new technology met that threshold to be given the breakthrough status by FDA. And it's really helpful for us because it allows us to engage with the FDA more often and faster than through a traditional regulatory approach. And so that's been a huge advantage for us, and that's leading us towards some of these milestones coming up.
Yeah, it sounds like an exciting year for reducer and for Neovasc, of course. If you would switch gears and move to Tiara, could you tell us what stage you are at? What are your competitors? What is the market? How big is the market? And how does Tiara differentiate compared to standard of care, maybe, and in addition to other competitors?
Yeah, so the Tiara device is a mitral valve implant. And so the mitral valve separates the left atrium from the left ventricle, and blood flows through. And then the idea is when the left ventricle contracts to pump blood into the heart, the valve closes off and prevents blood from going backwards into the lungs. And it's actually the most commonly diseased valve in the heart. And the challenge with that, the traditional standard of care, if a patient needs a replacement of a mitral valve, well, a physician has to go and they have to saw open the chest bone. They have to put the patient on a heart-lung bypass machine. They have to stop the heart. They cut open the heart itself. They replace the mitral valve with a prosthetic mitral valve. Then they sew up the heart. They hit the patient with a defibrillator to get the heart to start again, and then they wire the chest shut. And most of these patients that have mitral valve disease are quite old. It's not uncommon to see patients that are 80 years old plus needing a mitral valve replacement. And unfortunately, for many of these patients, if you don't get a diseased or leaky mitral valve fixed, the patients don't do very well. In fact, upwards of half of them die within 5 years. So it's a very poor prognosis, yet a very invasive surgery that many patients of that age just can't undergo. So many of those patients end up not getting treated at all. And so what we've been able to do with Tiara is come up with a less invasive way of replacing the mitral valve. So what we do is we go in with a keyhole incision between a couple of ribs. The patient's heart never stops beating. We don't put them on a heart-lung bypass machine. We go in through the apex or the bottom of the heart, and we put in a new valve inside of the existing native valve that's there. So it's a less invasive way of replacing the mitral valve, and we think it's a true advance potentially in the standard of care.
That sounds great. I think this was a very educational question, so thanks for that. If you would talk about the competitors, could you maybe provide some differentiating factors for Tiara?
Yeah, so there's lots of activity in the mitral valve space, and in fact, my former employer, Abbott, has a couple of devices out there. So they have the MitraClip device, which is approved in Europe and approved in the United States. And they also have a less invasive valve that they acquired from a company called Tendyne a few years ago that was actually the first less invasive valve to be approved in Europe. And that just happened a few months ago. They've just started doing commercial implants. They use a similar approach. They go in between a couple of ribs. The patient stays, the heart is beating the entire time. And they've really paved the way for other companies to make it to market. So they have a CE mark in Europe. It's not yet available in the United States. And then there are other companies like Medtronic, like Edwards, and a lot of smaller startups that are also working on less invasive approaches. So we're hopeful that with our device, we've been working carefully with our notified body in Europe to try to get a CE mark approval for European rights to sell the device. And we're hopeful that towards the end of this year or maybe early next year that we can get a regulatory decision on our transapical, that's that between the rib device, for an approval potentially in Europe. We're also working on a next generation device that actually would go in a vein in the leg. So not even having to make a hole between the ribs, we would almost put it in like a stent where you would go in through a blood vessel in the groin or in the leg and then snake the valve up into the heart and place it in the beating heart. That would allow interventional cardiologists to perform the procedure in the cardiac cath lab. And we also think that that would be a potential market expander as well. So we have the transapical or between the rib version in Europe. We have the transfemoral or in the vein in the leg version that we're working towards a first in human case in the United States towards the end of this year. So we've got big milestones that are coming up for Reducer, big milestones that are coming up for the transapical Tiara, as well as the transfemoral Tiara, and that's what we're really focused on as an organization.
That sounds great. I think the follow-up question would be if you could highlight the milestones for Tiara and maybe Reducer as well, so our audience can hear it all together again. So what will be the main catalyst for the company?
Yeah, so let me start with Tiara, then I'll go on to Reducer. So with Tiara transapical, I think the next big thing that we would see would be the potential for a European approval. And we've talked about 2021 or sooner for transapical Tiara. For the transfemoral, or the venous version that goes in through the leg, the next big thing would be our first in human implant, and we're looking at that towards the end of this year for the transfemoral version. For the Reducer device, the next big milestone for us would be an FDA panel meeting that could happen as early as the back half of this year. And then following that, the potential for a regulatory decision, a potential approval of the Reducer device in the United States.
That sounds great. Thank you very much for highlighting all the milestones. It sounds like a very exciting story, in addition to exciting year for Neovasc. And thank you very much for joining us here with our discussions. And we'll follow the story. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity. I love to speak about Neovasc, and thanks for your time and attention. Appreciate it.
You're great at it too, so it's very educational. I'm sure our audience will find it educational as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Ahu, this was an extremely educational interview. I was just wondering, in terms of the Reducer product, where are they in Europe? Do they have, are there any particular issues that they've seen with the product? And what does the competitive field look like in Europe?
Sure, thanks for that question. That's a great question, Michael. So they are approved in Europe for Reducer product, and there are no other options for Reducer for the refractory patient population. So they have no competition, and they reached to double-digit sales in the last quarters. Also, I would like to highlight, company was added to the European Society of Cardiology guideline, which is a major accomplishment for them and for the commercial opportunity. So there are no issues, no competition, and they're doing quite well on the sales perspective.
And in terms of the company's liquidity, I mean, because obviously getting to commercialization in the US is going to cost a lot of money. They have a lot of milestones coming up here within the next year. What does their liquidity position look like at this point?
So they closed the last quarter with 7 million. And they actually recently raised about 16 million on the month of June. So they do have enough cash, liquid cash, to carry on with the commercial and clinical opportunities for the products.
Well, it's a fascinating company. Thank you for bringing them to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael.